A young Roman noble, a criminal lawyer by trade, had set out with his retinue upon a ship on the Mediterranean Sea for a bit of an adventure. At 25 years old, he was headed to the city of Rhodes to study oration, public speaking. The ship that he was on had reached the Aegean Sea between modern-day Greece and Anatolia, and he was this close to Rhodes when his ship was set upon by pirates. Now these pirates captured this young man and took him for ransom. They set his ransom and informed him that he needed to send word for the ransom to be paid. 20 talents of gold. Let's put this in perspective and do some quick math. A talent was a measurement, about 50 kgs by some estimates, 110 pounds. A kg of gold today goes for almost 60,000 US dollars. 1 talent of gold, $3 million, which means these pirates ransomed this young noble for $60 million. You know what happens next? The young noble bursts out laughing. "You're going to be joking," he says. "You don't know who you've captured. I'll pay 50 talents for my freedom." The pirates look at him and go, "As you wish." But the young noble adds in a jesting manner, "But when I get my freedom, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to crucify every last one of you." And so they take him into captivity. And the noble sends most of his retinue, his clique, to go and notify his friends and allies so that they can raise this vast sum of gold, $150 million in today's money. These pirates must have been licking their chops. But they treated him and his remaining friend and 2 servants rather well. And this was in fact commonplace back then for taking somebody against their will and ransoming them. Now this young man wasn't held in a prison. In fact, he had some measure of freedom. And while the young noble and the pirates waited for this ransom to arrive, for the next 38 days, the young noble and the pirates, they develop this camaraderie. He would join in with the pirates when they would play games or exercise. He acted not only as their friend, but almost their leader. He would address them as subordinates. When they would be causing a racket when he was trying to sleep, he'd send his servant to go and tell them to shut up. He would write poems and speeches and read them aloud to the pirates. And if they didn't show enough pleasure or admiration for his artistry, he would tell them, "Ah, so what do you know? After all, you're just a bunch of illiterate savages. And I'm going to have you all crucified." And the pirates, they loved it. They found it incredibly endearing, kind of like when a child insults you. And then one day the gold finally arrived. And this noble's captivity, it came to an end. And he leaves and he heads for the city of Miletus, a Greek city under Roman rule. And there in Miletus, the noble manages to raise a naval force to go after these pirates, despite the fact he had never held any public office or military rank. And then he leads this force against the pirates and he finds them still on the island. And in turn he takes them captive. And he confiscates this vast fortune of gold along with all of their other valuables. The young noble then goes and pays a visit to the praetor of Asia Minor, the official, the magistrate, whose job it was to hear cases and meet punishment. And he says to the praetor, "Well, I've captured these pirates and I thought it would only be right for you to be the one to deal with them." But this praetor was wise to the game here, and he equivocates, he hums and he haws, and he says, "Oh well, we'll need to fully investigate this matter," implying that he wanted some of the nobleman's gold in order to serve justice. So the nobleman, he takes his leave of the praetor and he goes right back to where he's got the pirates held captive. And he crucifies every last one of them. And so ends the tale of this band of Cilician pirates But the tale of Julius Caesar, well, that was just getting started. Tsar, Kaiser, words with a strikingly negative valence to them, but both translations of the word Caesar a certain Roman surname. Goes to show the impact that one person can have, that whole dynastic monarchies borrow your surname to give their regimes weight and credibility. Julius Caesar is the embodiment of the idea of symbolic immortality, because over 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him. And even if you don't know all that much about history or Caesar, you've probably heard the phrase, I came, I saw, I conquered, maybe even crossing the Rubicon. Perhaps you might have even heard et tu, Brute. Today we're going to look at the mind of Caesar. It's a symbiosis of history, psychology, but most importantly, supposition. So what can we glean from Caesar's time with the pirates? Firstly, that Caesar had a Machiavellian streak in him. He was capable of the commission of evil in service of his sense of justice, sure, but I would argue more importantly, to further his aims and ambitions. Ask yourself, when Caesar brought all of that gold back to the people that he had borrowed it off, what did he stand to gain? Credit score. He was good for the money. Reputation. He said he was going to do it, and he did it. This was an act that would have put members of high society on notice. This Gaius Julius Caesar was an up-and-comer. Now in that vein, only a few years later in Rome in 69 BC, Caesar's paternal aunt passed away. Now this aunt of his was the widow of a very important man, Gaius Marius, the Roman general who was elected consul a record number of times, who reformed the Roman army, who went to war with the conservatives, the optimates, and unleashed a reign of terror when he took control of Rome itself. The man who had no shortage of responsibility for the eventual fall of the Republic. Marius was part of the Populares faction, the party of the people, as it were. And while Marius had helped tear the late Roman Republic almost in two, and while he was towards his end absolutely a tyrant, upon his death there were still many who carried his flame, particularly among the common folk, and Caesar, perhaps seeking to take on the mantle of Marius, delivered a funeral oration for his aunt, Marius's widow. A rare thing in those days for a woman to receive a funeral oration. Now this suggests that Caesar was always on the hunt for an opportunity to improve his standing with the public, and that kind of cunning, it certainly takes a certain intelligence. Caesar was undoubtedly a highly intelligent man, probably a genius that wanted everybody to get out of the way of his genius and let him do exactly what he wanted. Caesar was also an S-tier strategist, particularly when it came to the battlefield. His victory in Gaul at Alesia is hard evidence of that. Alesia, where Caesar brought 8 years of war to a closure by defeating 2 armies simultaneously through engineering and careful conservation of force. But his battlefield victories also reveal that Caesar had a strong understanding for human psychology. He understood what made people tick, and he understood group morale. At the Battle of Sabus, during his campaign in Gaul, Caesar's troops were ambushed by a Gaulic tribe called the Nervi. The Nervi had Caesar's legions on the ropes, having routed the Roman cavalry and scared off Caesar's reinforcements. Caesar overlooked the battlefield and saw that his 12th legion was about to break. They'd lost many of their commanders and most of the commanders that remained standing were wounded. Those that fought on were starting to lose their will to fight. Sensing what needed to be done, Caesar took a shield from one of the soldiers in the rear and moved up to the front, addressing each of his centurions, commanders of 100 men, calling these men by their names and inspiring them to continue the fight and to order their men forwards. The men of the legion were this close to breaking, but by tying his fate to theirs, he made the ultimate gamble, a gamble that their love for their leader would spur them on. Now, whether you read this as yet another purely Machiavellian play by Caesar, or whether you find some nobility in that, well, that is up to you. But one thing we can say about Caesar is that he never forgot his troops. He rewarded them every step along the way. He had a mind to share both in privation and abundance. And while Caesar was amazingly generous, was that generosity pure? Or was it merely transactional? Neil Coffey, in his book Gift and Gain, How Money Transformed Ancient Rome, states his case that Caesar saw generosity as, in essence, both a way to ingratiate yourself with others, to build loyalty, but more importantly, as a means of propaganda against your adversaries. Put simply, money was merely a means by which to obtain dignitas. Dignitas, a concept that defies one English word, but an approximation might be prestige, power and respect, all wrapped up in a nice little bow. And in that vein, it's not altogether dissimilar from the concept of face within Asian cultures, or the concept of mana in Māori culture. This dignitas concept, it's really important when it comes to trying to understand the mind of Caesar, because it's one of the central goals of his striving, and it informs both actions that we, as somewhat dispassionate observers, might endorse, but also his gambles and his follies. Take crossing the Rubicon, for example. At that point, matters had reached a head between Caesar, Pompey, and the Senate, and nobody could back down without losing dignitas, and nobody was willing to lose dignitas. But had Caesar not had the backing of his legions in this whole endeavour, he might not have gone through with it at all. After all, Caesar had made it so that his legions and their love and loyalty that they had for him were extensions of his self-concept. Perhaps Caesar's most renowned quality was his clementia, his clemency, his forgiveness towards those who had opposed him. Caesar was the archetype of the word magnanimous. Within Rome, Caesar was famous for it. In fact, one of his final honours that he received before his untimely demise was the building of a temple to the fact that during the Civil War he granted clemency to a lot of his opponents, allowing them to keep their lives, their station and even their property. But again, how much of this was due to Caesar doing good in the service of Caesar? That's not to say that sparing the lives of those who would have taken yours is not a noble act unto itself. It is. More that we should probably situate it within the context of the man and his motivation. And to that point, in Caesar's own history of his Gallic campaigns, he mentions his clementia and forgiveness of Gallic leaders in no fewer than a half dozen passages. And remember what Churchill said about history. I know it shall be kind to me, because I will be the one who writes it. And so, perhaps from that we should infer that Caesar's clemency might all circle back around to self-promotion in the service of Dignatas. Now, often in life, when we're making inferences about behaviour under conditions, it pays to observe what happens when the opposite condition arises. Caesar was very good-natured with his opponents insofar as they allowed him to bestow his forgiveness of their sins. But what happened when he was denied that opportunity? To that accord, we have two examples to work with here. Let's tackle Pompey first. Pompey was a towering figure in history in his own right. You kind of have to be in order to be given the epithet Pompey the Great. And while Pompey's story is certainly one for another day, it's worth mentioning that this was a man whom Caesar had a close personal bond with. It was Pompey, along with Crassus, that Caesar had formed the first triumvirate, the trio that took over Rome. When Pompey's wife died, Caesar married off his own daughter Julia to Pompey. Pompey, who was, by the way, 30-something years her senior. Pompey, who was 6 years older than Caesar himself. Julia, who was already engaged to another man. I mention all of this to show the lengths that Caesar had gone to in order to bind Pompey to him. Of course, it also makes Pompey his son-in-law. When Julia passed away, that bond between Pompey and Caesar was weakened though, and with Pompey's subsequent marriage to the daughter of a prominent conservative in the Senate and his reconciliation with those same conservatives, Pompey became convinced that Caesar needed to be brought to heel. And so when civil war broke out, Pompey sided with the conservatives in the Senate. And there are intonations in Caesar's memoirs of the Civil War that he felt personally hurt by this. Caesar writes that Pompey's motivations were because he was incited by Caesar's enemies, and because Pompey was unwilling to bear the fact that anybody could hold an equal amount of dignitas to him, i.e. Caesar, and so had alienated himself from Caesar's friendship. But then Caesar adds this point, which drives home the sense that Caesar felt personally wounded. Caesar writes, "At the same time, Pompey had reconciled himself with Caesar and Pompey's common enemies, even though it was Pompey, through his actions, who had brought the wrath down upon Caesar in the first place." And aside from this passage revealing a vulnerability, it takes a certain type to refer to themselves in the third person. But from the start of the Civil War, Caesar was looking for the opportunity to bring about a peace and forgive Pompey, along with all of the other prominent figures who had settled on conflict against Caesar. Now, when Caesar triumphed over Pompey at the climactic battle of Pharsalus in Greece, Caesar was distressed to learn that Pompey had escaped, and he was denied his opportunity to bestow his Clementia. And he sent some of his best soldiers after Pompey to bring him to Caesar alive. Pompey, meanwhile, had escaped on a boat and had sailed to Egypt. And when Caesar got wind of this, he set sail from Rome with a force towards Egypt himself, only to learn, when he arrived, that the Pharaoh, seeking to ingratiate himself with Caesar, had dealt to Pompey. On being presented with this macabre trophy, Caesar broke down in tears, denied his opportunity to bestow his Clementia that is given. But perhaps this does show that there was indeed a sense of great loss for Caesar, beyond merely a denial of his ability to exercise his virtue. One thing is for certain though, Caesar didn't take kindly to the Pharaoh Ptolemy's interference, turning his grief outwards as rage and quickly embroiling himself in a civil war between this young Pharaoh, Ptolemy, and his sister, one Cleopatra. Caesar taking the side of Cleopatra and eventually giving way to his most common vice of passionate love affairs, with her as his object of affection. The other example of Caesar being denied his Clementia is, on the one hand, perhaps less prominent of a story, but might provide a greater insight into how Caesar actually thought. And it concerns this man named Cato the Younger. Now, Cato was a conservative senator who was one of the principal people opposing Caesar in the Civil War. Cato had long feared Caesar's ambitions, reckoning him to be a mortal concern to the Republic. And Cato had fled to Africa when Caesar had taken both the Italian peninsula and then Greece thereafter. And Cato had been given a small city in North Africa by the followers of Pompey to take command of. With Caesar closing in on him and eventually surrounding the city, Cato took his fate into his own hands, choosing to depart this mortal coil. Caesar arrived again too late, and as he stood over what remained of Cato, he said, "As you envied me my opportunity to grant you clemency, I envy you this fate, Cato." What does that say? History author Tom Holland reckons that through this act, Cato denied Caesar the very thing that he sought most, and that although Caesar had defeated every enemy he had engaged in battle, Cato, by taking matters into his own hands and choosing his fate, had defeated Caesar. And to that point, there's some evidence that Cato's grand finale weighed heavily on Caesar's mind. The news of Cato's fate was understandably all Rome could talk about, and by his action, he became a light for the Republican cause to rally around, and it frustrated Caesar to no end. And this frustration, coupled with Caesar's increasing egotism, contributed to Caesar making a critical error. Once the Civil War had concluded, Caesar finally had a chance for his triumphs. A triumph was a parade on a scale not seen in our modern society. It was the very thing all ambitious Romans dreamed of, and Caesar had banked up enough victories for several of these triumphs. And so, in Caesar's mind, he was going to have all of these triumphs. One for Gaul, one for Egypt, one for Asia Minor, and one triumph for his victory in Africa. Although that fooled absolutely nobody. The citizenry knew exactly what the play was. That campaign in Africa was against their fellow Romans. It was sacrilegious to celebrate that victory. To make matters much worse, Caesar commissions a float for this parade, depicting Cato's final act. And this makes the Roman citizenry, who are usually very pro-Caesar by the way, it makes them break down in tears. And Caesar is absolutely livid by this. Now perhaps Caesar's anger here is due in part to being denied validation, that his people, the people of Rome, were rebuking him, and his moment of celebration, that they did not share his feelings towards Cato. So we can surmise here that Caesar's egotism might have been a set of blinders to the perspectives of others, blinders that may have led to blunders. But the question remains, did those same blinders lead Caesar to miss the signs that there was a conspiracy brewing against him? Caesar had by this stage accrued power the likes of few in Rome had known before, and there were concerns brewing that he sought to be king. Now kings were anathema in the Roman Republic, and those that even gave the air of wanting to become king often met violent ends. And so it was a scandal when one day the two tribunes of the plebs, the elected representatives of the common folk, found a crown placed atop the statue of Caesar in the Roman Forum. Nobody knew who had put it there, and it generated a great deal of gossip. The tribunes ordered it to be removed, as they knew the implications here. However, Caesar had become suspicious of them, thinking that they had placed the diadem, the crown, there themselves, in order that they might have the honour of having it removed. So Caesar had the capacity for suspicion, but this example only reveals suspicion towards self-aggrandizement. Shortly thereafter, however, Caesar was travelling back to Rome along the Appian Way, and several people among the crowd greeted him as Rex, the Roman word for king, but also a surname. And Caesar quipped back, "I am not Rex, but Caesar," playing with the words as though they had mistaken his surname. When the two tribunes learned of this, they had the first man who had shouted Rex arrested. But in Caesar's mind, this was yet more proof that they were up to something nefarious. Rather than these two tribunes merely trying to maintain the delicate balance, keeping the lid on the powder keg in Rome at this time. Now, at a later Senate meeting, Caesar had the two men removed from their posts, a move that deeply angered the common folk of Rome, who were ostensibly Caesar's own support base. This shows that Caesar's ability to successfully navigate complex political situations at this point, in the twilight of the Republic, well, it betrays either a naivety towards Republican norms or a complete disregard for them, thinking that he had accrued enough love of the people to act outside the bounds of convention. It was just one mistake among many that began to pile up for Caesar. But Caesar's biggest mistake was his assumption that those whom he had been close with and who had turned on him, and who he had in turn forgiven with his Clementia, would remain loyal to him in light of it. Marcus Junius Brutus was a Roman politician and a general whom had been close to Caesar. He also had an antipathy for Pompey, who he felt was responsible for the passing of his father. But Brutus was also proud of his heritage, tracing his family lineage back to those who had ended the reign of kings in Rome. Complicating matters, Caesar and Brutus's mother had been engaged in a long-standing affair during their youth, which, according to Plutarch, coincided with Brutus's birth. And some have commented that Caesar felt Brutus could be his biological son, and at least he looked upon Brutus with a paternal eye. And so when Brutus sided with the Optimates and Pompey in the civil war, Caesar was anguished. But as the climactic battle in the civil war between Pompey and Caesar approached at Pharsalus in Greece, Caesar gave orders that Brutus was to be taken prisoner if he gave himself up, but to leave him be if he continued to fight, and to cause him no harm, and to even allow him to escape. When Brutus did escape, he wrote to Caesar, and Caesar welcomed him into the camp and promptly bestowed his Clementia. And there's some indication in the literature that Caesar was just happy Brutus was all right. And so, as Caesar took off to Egypt to pursue Pompey, he left Brutus in charge of Gaul, an important posting. But as I've described, in the wake of the civil war, Caesar was accruing many enemies in Rome, both among the public, but more importantly, among the Senate. And while he was still beloved among much of the common folk, it was by no means universal. Graffiti had begun to appear in the streets, glorifying Brutus's ancestor who had slain the king, and disparaging Caesar for his supposed ambitions to be king. Meanwhile, Brutus was heckled in the courts about his failure to live up to his ancestors' actions, and this ultimately had the desired effect on Brutus, who began to foment a plan, along with some others in the Senate, to have Caesar taken out. Now for Caesar, who was by this point dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, one would think he would have the sense to have had an intelligence network, people he could rely upon, who would have made him aware that people, according to Plutarch, powerful people, were trying to turn Brutus against Caesar. But again, here we can infer that Caesar either wasn't aware of this or just didn't take it seriously enough. Certainly, his scruples would have prevented him from taking tyrannical measures. Caesar had firmly stated he never intended to rule by terror like Sulla did. But had Caesar fully grasped that there was an effort to turn Brutus against him, he might have sent Brutus away to that important posting in Gaul and ensured he stayed there. Instead, his inaction betrays either an ignorance of the true state of affairs or a rejection of them and a belief that his good deeds rendered him safe from plots against him. This would in the end prove to be Caesar's undoing. As he lay there in the curio of Pompey, the Senate hall, as his assailants drove their weapons unto him, he saw amongst them one Brutus who stepped forth, and Caesar uttered his final words, "You too, my child," before pulling his toga over his head and awaiting his end. And so ended the life of Gaius Julius Caesar. And if, for the sake of a thought experiment, we were to write a phrase upon his tombstone, what would it be? I think it would be this: "Here lies the most self-driven man to have ever walked the earth." And when I say self-driven, I mean he was driven by his self-concept. Symbolic immortality, written in stone. Well, thank you for watching all this way. If you liked the video, I've got a bunch more planned. And not just inside the mind, although I want that to be a flagship series. But I also want to create videos about psychological theories, about media, current events, philosophy, the intersection of all of these things, and anything else that takes my interest. This channel isn't about chasing analytics. And if I have to sacrifice a bit of growth to make the content that I want to make and to just enjoy this process of creation, well, that's fine by me. I don't know if this channel is going to be a success, but I do know one thing. I'm glad you're here with me. So if you want to see more of this, you know what to do. Alright, that's all for now. Until next time.